Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome. In 1842, Colonel William J. Worth, commanding in Florida, unilaterally announced the end of hostilities between the U.S. government and the Seminole Indians of Florida. He ordered a reburial of many soldiers who had perished in the 7-year Second Seminole War. Despite its inconclusive ending, the war had been an important proving ground for the Army and for its West Point trained leadership. Worth was a West Point graduate himself, as had been 5 of the 7 officers in Dade's command who died in the initial battle that signified the war's beginning. On August 15th, then, hundreds of regular Army soldiers marched through St. Augustine. They were escorting 7 wagons representing the 7 years of the war, carrying the remains of the fallen soldiers. The column bore the remains to their final resting place, a garden next to St. Francis Barracks. This subsequent reinterment procession was a solemn remembrance, not a victory march. For the past 14 years, in today's St. Augustine National Cemetery, the West Point Society of North Florida has organized an annual commemoration of this first event as a means of keeping faith with those fallen, and to bring attention to all who suffered and sacrificed, soldier, citizen, and Seminole alike, during this long, difficult struggle. Joining us today is Joseph Nafziger, a retired Army colonel and West Point graduate of the class of 1960. He discusses the strong ties to the Second Seminole War demonstrated through the outsized role of many U.S. military academy graduates, and how it served as a proving ground for some who went on to command armies in the Mexican and American Civil Wars. Joe Nafziger, welcome to the Seminole Wars.
Thank you, Pat.
How big a role did West Point officers have in the Second Seminole War?
It turns out that Seminole Wars, particularly the Second Seminole War from 35 to 42, saw an outside participation by young West Point graduates. In fact, Point graduates played an enormous role in the Second Seminole War, who were present in most all of its dramatic action. The first Commandant of Cadets was killed in the opening battle, and the fourth Commandant of Cadets is the commanding officer who signed the order declaring that hostilities have ceased.
Who were these?
First Commandant of Cadets was Captain Gardner, who was killed in the opening ambush of Major Dade's column, 1835. The fourth Commandant of Cadets was Colonel Worth, the same Worth as Fort Worth, who went on to fight both in the Mexican and the Civil War. And Colonel Worth was a commanding officer of the troops of the regular Army in Florida the summer of 1842, when he signed the orders that not only ended the war without a formal treaty, but also prepared the way for a concluding parade and reinterment ceremony at the garden of the barracks in St. Augustine.
So who was reinterred with St. Augustine, and why St. Augustine?
St. Augustine was the oldest major town and rear headquarters during the entire war, and much like Honolulu was in the Vietnam War. There was the major barracks in the whole state was at St. Augustine. They had a garden. That was the appropriate place to collect remains throughout the state of the select soldiers, officers and soldiers who had died in the war, and bring them to that garden in the St. Augustine Barracks, called St. Francis Barracks, and was converted from a nunnery to a military barracks by the British when they were here in the 1800s.
So how big a deal was the reinterment parade?
It was quite a stunning affair, actually. We are fortunate to have a very comprehensive report of it in the newspapers, in the St. Augustine News of 20 August. It took place on the 15th of August. Colonel Worth, prior to issuing his order terminating the hostilities, had issued an order to gather up the remains of officers who have been killed in battle, who have died on service, including those of non-commissioned officers and soldiers, who fell with Major Dade, as also those of several non-commissioned officers and privates who fell under peculiar circumstances of gallantry and conduct. Reinterment took place on the 15th of August, 1842. Parade of 500 regular Army troops and cannon. Procession came down through the city, bearing the remains in 7 wagons draped with the American flag, pulled by 5 elegant mules under half-hour guns, changed to minute guns in the actual ceremony. And then there were distinguished talk and comments given over the site, which were 3 vaults that had been prepared to accept the remains. And these vaults then afterwards were covered with coquina pyramids. And these 3 coquina pyramids have become the icon of both the cemetery and really the National Cemetery system. They remain, are probably the oldest monuments in any national cemetery in the United States.
What got you interested and engaged in the Seminole War's milieu?
Seminole Wars contain not only a lot of history that is interesting and unique in the development of the United States, but also that pertains directly to West Point. Really didn't pay much attention at all to the wars until I came down to Florida in 1995. I joined the West Point Society of North Florida. We have a mission of trying to keep West Point contributions to the United States in the public consciousness, so people realize the contributions that West Point has made to the development of the country and hopefully will continue to make.
What other West Point graduates are of note from the Second Seminole War?
It's really quite a list of graduates who were young lieutenants, most of them, during the Seminole War, and then went on, fought most of them in the Mexican War, war with Mexico, and became senior officers in the Civil War. For example, General Hooker, class of 35, General Anderson, class of 25, General Johnson, Joe Johnson, 29, General Sedgwick, 37, General Bragg, 37 as well. By the way, he was in the parade which buried the interred remains in 1842. General Magruder, General Thomas, General Sherman, and General Hardy, 38, just to name a few.
David Moniak, who died in the war, was also the first Native American to graduate from West Point.
Yeah, that's correct. He was a class of 1822, the first Native American, basically a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. Served a short time in the Army, then retired as plantation owner up in the Carolinas when the Seminole War broke out, 1835-36. He raised a regiment of Creek Indians, took them south. He was promoted to brevet major, played a leading role in the Battle of the Wahoo Swamp. However, as he was leading his unit of Creeks through the swamp against the Seminoles, he was shot through the head and killed. But then Ixum then was one of the ones that was brought back to the St. Augustine Cemetery for reinterment. St. Augustine is home of the Florida National Guard. Command historian of the Florida National Guard was one Gregory Moore. He was a lieutenant colonel, class of 1974, an avid historian of the military in general, but also this particular period, Florida's territorial existence before it became a state. Gregory said, I want to give you a little talk about the National Cemetery here in St. Augustine and the history that got it started on its way. What we decided to do back in 2006 was, well, let's remember this very moving ceremony and parade each year as close to 15 August as possible on a Saturday. Let's remember this and invite people into it so that we can keep it alive. It represents not just the burial of a number of West Point officers, but it represents the sacrifice and service of all who perished in the long Second Seminole War. We try to bring in reenactors and interested organizations and visitors from around Florida. So we try to keep this in front of the public consciousness. This war, which was big and long, big for the time, and long for the time, and we try to elevate perception of the population through this annual ceremony.
Prior to you and Greg Moore getting together to do this, there was not a commemoration ceremony.
No, although I understand that in the past, some of the reenactors, Greg and others, like to call them living historians, which of course they truly are, time to time gathered at the pyramid for a brief informal ceremony. But this was the first organized event that tried to pattern itself after the actual parade and ceremony in 1842. We grew it basically 2020. This year will be the 13th iteration, and we knew we had to start small, but we grew it year by year by year until we had really a very substantial event, marching down to the pyramids in the morning, then lunch, and followed by a talk on the Seminole War from various important researchers in the area.
Why is it important to do this?
This is in the annals of making sure history is not lost. There is a large effort of parade and so forth as a way of remembering the past. It was clear, at least to many of us, that the Second Seminole War was, except for some of the people born in the actual region, the ones living in the south central portion of Florida, except for them, there was very little knowledge in or interest in what happened during this period. And it was a critical period, not only in developing states, but also in developing the American Army.
You have reenactors, you have living historians. Why are they essential to this commemoration, and what do they do?
The reenactors add color as their stories. Each one of them basically has a story of who's representing. So the public gets to mingle and talk with them, and you also have a visual impact that brings you hopefully back into the period. Remember that the Seminole Wars took place before photography. Oh, the only thing we have, paintings and some temporary sketches for the most part, and some modern paintings by living artists who imagine or reconstruct what must have looked like. But these living historians then dress up exactly, and as a matter of fact, one of the major additions that have come online to represent the wagons carrying the remains is an exact replica of the 1846 limber caisson drawn by two elegant mules. This whole caisson in operation was developed by Tom Fitzgerald, a retired Marine Master Sergeant who lives near the Cape Canaveral Cemetery. He has come up every year now for the past some years with his team of mules. The flag is draped over the beautiful caisson with the casket, and it makes quite a visual impact as it goes down the street. We also have incorporated from the very beginning an exact replica of the 6-pound cannon which accompanied Major Dade's faithful column. This is a 6-pound cannon which is run by the Peace River Artillery. They have come up every year, and they fire 4 or 5 rounds to simulate the minute gun.
Up at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy in New York, there's a monument. They also have part of the cannon. What was that?
Cannon that accompanied Dade's column also was serviced by what they call a sponge staff and rammer, used to swab down the board and take out any spark so that the blue powder won't ignite. And then the other end is used to ram down the shot of the powder in the shot. Well, of course, this was with the cannon at the time of the ambush in Major Dade's ambush. 5 of the 7 officers in the column were West Point graduates. What happened was about 6 weeks later, burial column from General Gaines came to the site, and actually First Lieutenant Duncan was with him. Now, First Lieutenant Duncan was from the same class as Lieutenant Basinger, who was in the column and was killed. And Lieutenant Duncan took this rammer staff, which was still in Basinger's hand, according to the note. He took it off of the battlefield, and in 1843, he sent it to West Point as a piece to be kept for historical purposes. The West Point Museum was just getting started, and with this rammer staff dating back to 1843, it allows West Point the bragging rights of the oldest specific military museum in the country. What we were able to do was to get this rammer staff on loan from the West Point Museum in 2015. They loaned it to us for 6 months so that we could display it here, and it was white. This museum that is right outside the Command Historian's office is in a couple of sections of the old St. Francis Barracks. Allison Simpson, who take over his job when Greg retired, and Allison broke through the bureaucracy in many, many ways to get the loan of the sponge staff back in 2015.
Since it began, the West Point Society in North Florida organized the event.
It started out by a committee 13 years ago. The committee was eclectic. We embraced people from different organizations and people that were just plain interested in the event and the Seminole War in general. And we grew it slowly, still based around the West Point aspect of it. However, as we grew up in terms of numbers of living historians and significance of the event, the Seminole Wars Foundation became very interested in it and became a very strong partner with us.
This year, it's going to be organized under Allison Simpson with the National Guard. What do you expect from this year's event, and how may it be a little different from past years?
Well, this year, things are going to be a little different, given the strictures that we're under, and we will have the event in a relatively small fashion to what we've had years past. There'll be no parade, but there will be a small honor guard at the cemetery. We will say a few words. We usually say the prayer, lay the wreath, and that will be pretty much it. However, at the same time, this will be the first time where the command historian of the Florida National Guard will be the overall organizer and host. West Point Society has brought it to a certain level, but the importance and reach of the event has expanded beyond strictly the West Point aspect of it, very much to our pleasure, and we're happy to see that. The Florida National Guard, Allison Simpson, has agreed to take over the mantle of leading the organizing committee. But she will be assisted very closely by our society, but also the Seminole Wars Foundation. So this year will be quiet. We will not advertise it the way we used to. At the present moment, we're not inclined to have large groups of people come. Probably we'll have about 10 reenactors, replayers. We still have bagpipe and buglers and drummers, so there will be some music.
Joe, the only thing I would change about it is move it to 15 December because it is hot and humid on the 15th of August.
Yes, it is. The 15th of August was hot, is hot, and will forever be hot. Fortunately, we're not out there in the open that long. Usually the parade kicks off around 10:45. The pyramid takes about 45 minutes. The rest of the time is spent at lunch, and the talks are spent in air-conditioned spaces. But we decided we really wanted that to be close to the date. And it just so happens that Saturday closest to the date this year is exactly the 15th.
I do want to give a shout out to the Boy Scouts because one year that I was up there and with heat and humidity, they were out there with cold bottles of water and they were bringing them around to people, making sure that folks got some liquids in their body before they collapsed.
Glad you brought that up. They're really great volunteers. The troop is led by one of the graduates on the committee. As a matter of fact, come to think of it, I gave a talk to that group about this whole event and what it signifies.
Out of your commemoration work, you joined the board of the Seminole Wars Foundation, and the foundation sponsors this podcast. What does the board do, and what do you do when you're serving on the board?
Another graduate introduced me to the foundation, and then after a couple of years working with Greg, who was on the board accepted me. And my particular interest was on St. Augustine in general, bring St. Augustine into the fold, because most of the people on the board are very familiar with all of those Seminole War sites from the Palace south. But not so much with St. Augustine, and this ceremony, they're experts and they knew about the ceremony, of course, but my effort on the board was to bring that to the fore in 2017. So we assisted the Seminole Wars Foundation of sponsoring a first convocation of Seminole War historians in conjunction with the event. And as you may be aware, this convocation is repeating itself every 2 years at various locations around Florida.
The convocation of Seminole War historians is for whom? Who can attend? And why did you want to do it?
It was another kind of brainchild from a combination of Greg and myself. We were driving back and forth to board meetings in the Seminole War Foundation. It was a 3-hour drive down to the headquarters there near Dade City, St. Augustine. Plenty of time to discuss things going back and forth. And we came across the idea that what can the Seminole War Foundation do that is kind of different from other Seminole War operations around Dade. They are mainly focused on specific sites, like the excellent one, Fort King or Okeechobee and so forth. Seminole War Foundation has always been involved heavily in overarching literature covering all aspects of the Seminole War Foundation and available to everybody, not focused necessarily on one or even 2 or 3 specific locations. Well, we thought that what really was kind of missing was an opportunity for all these other locations of organizations and clubs involved in the Seminole War aspect to get together periodically and exchange ideas. And so this led to the fact of a convocation, all the folks coming together, living historians, formal organizations, and having a 2 or 3 day meeting. We kind of came on the idea once every 2 years. And this has proved very popular. The first one we kicked off in St. Augustine here in combination with the 2017 commemoration of the cemetery. But then it went to Okeechobee. It'll be at Fort King in a couple of years, and I'm not sure who has it this year.
Loxahatchee.
There you are. So these other organizations have stepped up and, we want to host this one, we want to host this one. So it proved to be a very valuable and well-attended.
Do you have to be a historian to attend?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I would highly recommend it to anybody. At convocations are the way you really get an overview for someone that's not been immersed in any of this before, or maybe just got a little inkling of it. So they get immersed in what's going on, any different perspective.
For wrapping up, what do you think the public should know as a takeaway about the Seminole Wars, maybe in particular the Second Seminole War, but this period in our nation's history?
Quite a formative period, certainly for Florida, without getting too deep into the very large civil aspect of it. What has kind of interested me for further inquiry is the foundation that it laid for the development of the United States Army. That aspect of it is overlooked. There have been a number of some literature just recently on how the Mexican War prepared both the South and the Northern armies, actually American armies, if you want to put it in those terms, how the Mexican War prepared them for the major conflicts, for example, the Trenton Ground by Martin Duger, West Pointers of the Civil War. But what they have missed, and yes, indeed, the Mexican War has taken junior officers. The junior officers became field-grade officers and learned how to handle large formations, participated in large operations in the Mexican War. But they cut their teeth in, for the most part, the Florida Wars and also to some other extent on the wars on the western frontiers. A lot of them were West Point graduates. They were operating in Florida in small units, relatively independent operations, and just what the junior officers need to learn. That aspect is what has intrigued me in particular. Also, you have the eye-opening dimension of the way the Indians were just basically pushed out of their territory. Some of them accepted it, others didn't, but nevertheless, we didn't give them much of a choice.
Joe Knapsinger, thanks for what you've done with setting up a convocation of historians, with commemorating the first commemoration of reinterring soldiers who perished in the Second Seminole War. And thanks for joining us today for the Seminole War podcast.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to get this out.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Podcast 2020, all rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Rita Youngman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman, all rights reserved.